I mean, I've never seen a martial art. Well, I mean, the simplest, I guess, would be just the fact that you don't have to change martial arts to do various different things. That would be an obvious one to me. Like if you're a stand-up fighter and you learn boxing, then great, or kickboxing or whatever, or even MMA. Which is probably closer and is conceptually probably to Systema in the versatility aspect. But I mean, you get asked these questions all the time. It's like, well, who would win in a fight, a boxer or Systema guy? And you're like, which boxer, which Systema guy? I mean, are we talking Muhammad Ali and a guy who's been training for a year in Systema? Then obviously Muhammad Ali. I mean, but if you're kind of like putting equal emphasis on both, well, it depends where they are. I mean, are they in the ring or are they in a street fight? And has the Systema guy been training for street fighting, and has the boxer also, in a way? The same thing could be said for a grappler or a knife fighter or whatever. So you have Philippine knife systems, which are usually considered the sort of benchmark for knife fighting. But then you also have European systems, which now are becoming more prevalent with the from the old medieval systems. Very useful. Grappling, obviously, jiu-jitsu and judo and sambo and things like that. But I think the difference for versatility is that I don't want to be changing conceptual systems as I'm moving from standing to knife fighting to ground. I don't want to have to change the way I'm thinking. I just want the environment to dictate how the concepts are sort of adjusting. That's all. So on a versatility scale, I think Systema has that down. You don't from standing to ground to multiple attackers to fighting in a car to being underwater or anything else. You're still working with the same fundamental principles, which you don't have to then, which removes a lot of cognitive load from your brain, and that allows you to strategize. And if you can strategize, then you can start to see. If you can see, then you can affect the fight in a very different way. I mean, to me, there's not. But I mean, to the outside observer, if they're poring over YouTube videos, then I would probably say this punch is probably the most recognizable thing that would be a different aspect as to how you might apply it. I mean, on the positive side, I'd say yeah. On the negative side, I'd also say that applying those types of strikes in a real fight without training it is not easy. And you have to do a lot of training in real environments to start to apply those types of percussive, internal, relaxed striking precisely. So on one side, yes, there's signature things that you would recognize in Systema, particularly probably the striking, that would look different to other martial arts. But within Systema itself, if you're only practicing those in static environments, then you're probably fooling yourself as to actually how they might apply in reality. I mean, again, for me, 25 years later or whatever it is, I mean, if you'd asked me this 2 years in, I would have had one answer, another one 4 years in, I'd had another answer. 20 years later, it's my focus is very different. I mean, it's more towards how my mind is working in various environments and things like that, rather than just the sort of physical aspects of a martial art. In fact, it has very little to do with the martial art at all. But you have to be careful with Systema or any martial art where you're not in a regular full contact sparring environment, that you're not fooling yourself. If combat is if you're doing it as a self-defense for high-level combat and you're not applying that in spontaneous full contact environments, then you could trick yourself into believing that you're doing something that effectively may not work at all. But if you're using the Systema, if combat is your goal, if you're using Systema and you are pushing yourself into more challenging, faster, full contact, full tension environments, there's very few weaknesses in it, really, as a concept, to be honest with you. I mean, everything. I mean, it's really not the system. Yeah, it's the person, right? I mean, it's, you know, what are your weaknesses, not necessarily what the system's weaknesses are. This way. I mean, the main difference between teaching the military or police and teaching in a seminar environment or a school environment usually is time. I mean, most of the time if I go to a seminar, I probably got half the room in there that were trained for 10 years or more, or trained with me for 10 years or more personally, you know. So I'm taking them to the next level of their training, and they're sort of like pushing me to show them what that level might be. So I'm learning at the same time, and, you know, obviously. When you go to a military environment, especially, I mean, you may have maximum 5 days with these guys, and they've probably never seen Systema before, or half the martial arts that you've done, or even your approach to martial arts they've never seen before. And somehow you've got to instill some sort of capability into them that's going to be useful to them the next day, you know, in a military or police environment. So the training is more basic, I would say, in some form, but more pointed at the same time. Whereas when I'm with a training group, I can be a little more fluid with what I'm teaching, and sort of like picking up on where their strengths might be or their weaknesses as individuals or groups, or I might pivot and sort of like change things towards a certain new direction if I feel that something's not really gelling in some way. And with a police or military environment, you tend to have to kind of stick to the program and you know, give them something you know that's really going to be effective in the next 24 hours. You know, it's the hardest things about training Systema is everything's spontaneous. You know, you're never going to say, look, only come at me like this, you know, overhead this, just here, you know, go. I mean, it's rare you're going to play that way. I mean, you might just to sort of like pick up on something or whatever, but you're going to change that really quickly into a spontaneous environment, because you're trying to train for that spontaneity, and you know, and so within that, stuff surprises me all the time. I mean, people do some crazy things sometimes, and you have to adapt immediately to that, and that's the game, is to create the kind of networks in your mind that can adapt to things. It's not about learning how to adapt to things, it's about creating environments that allow you to adapt to things spontaneously, you know. So if I don't get surprised by things, I'm kind of not teaching properly, to be honest with you.
Do you find it very different from country to country? I mean,
it depends what, yeah, I mean, you know, obviously there's certain, I mean, I don't want to, it sounds like you're stereotyping if you sort of say, well, you know, these countries are knife fighters and these countries are fist fighters and stuff, but it kind of is like that. And, you know, when I go to certain places, they're much more interested in, say, you know, knife fighting, because that's a very likely thing that's going to happen there, or other places are more sort of mass fist fighting and they're interested in that. And, you know, some places have a grappling is prevalent there and they want to know how to deal with that sort of thing. So it depends on the culture of the place. But again, now culture is so much more blended. It's like it could be anything. So there's not like, it's not as pointed as it used to be as to, okay, these guys like this and these guys like this. In military environments, it's a little bit easier because they're mission orientated. Like, okay, we're going to go onto a boat and, you know, we're on this sort of like rocking environment. You know, there's a lot of hard surfaces. We've got to learn how to deal with this. And so you can train specifically for an environment that you know that they're likely to be in, you know, or you know, or they're taking down someone in a house or something, you know, or removing someone from a car or something. So they're usually more like, there's specialized groups for doing specialized things, and that's what they tend to bring that group in to go and do. And so that can be a little bit easier to sort of be more specific as to what you want to train. But other than that, yeah, there's sort of cultural things, and you get a sense of it pretty quickly when you're there as to, and also just their skill set. You know, that you can tell when you're in a knife fighting country because the guys know how to use knives very well, or if they're in a fist fighting country, they're usually pretty handy. You know.
What was the United Kingdom fist fighting?
One of the things you've got to watch out for the most in the United Kingdom is headbutts.
Headbutts.
Yes.
Okay. That's a special.
That's kind of the opening and closing argument usually in a fight in England. So, I mean, if you look at the concept of the words that you're saying, I mean, martial art means military or war art, right? I mean, it's a war art, and the end result of any war art is to be able to kill somebody and dominate their space in some form or another. And if you're asking whether Systema is very good at that, that's exactly what it's designed for. I mean, as far as I can tell, right? It is a military system. Yeah. We'll never have children again, that one. It will live, but no.
I will give you chopsticks.
Yeah. But if you look at the reality of a war art, I mean, is it just to dominate your opponent? Well, there's a lot of answers to that. I mean, what does that really mean? If you've gone to war in some form or another, and you get sick, or somebody gets injured in your unit or something like that, and you don't know how to heal them, then should that be part of your war art? Because if you lose capability within your unit, then that unit cohesion goes away, your numbers go away, your advantage goes away, then, you know, it depends what you mean by martial art in that sense. So it could be as important to have a healing art as part of your martial art as it is to have a killing art as part of your martial art. And I think that's again where Systema becomes really interesting to me, because the healing aspect is the war aspect. Yeah, I mean, anything that's not evolving dies, right? So, I mean, you know, if it wasn't evolving, Systema would have stopped 10 years ago.
Evolution, or positively or negatively, right? It's a change.
Doesn't matter.
Just change. Yeah.
Evolution is a messy process.
What are the biggest?
It's not a straight line.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What are the biggest?
There's more dead ends in evolution than there are living ones. And so, I mean, if you ask me about the evolution of Systema, I mean, who knows? I mean, who knows what the evolution? I mean, I'm just a small piece on that time scale. I mean, either Systema came about in the 50s and 60s, or it came about 1,000 years ago. I mean, and there's probably been a tremendous amount of evolution.
But during your time, have you seen any change? More fighting, less fighting, more violence, more breeding, more inner...
Yeah, I mean, you see a change, but also I'm evolving with it too, so my concept of it is changing as... It could be exactly the same, and I'm seeing it differently, because I've changed. You know, I mean, you know, I can't remember...
So, in what way?
Who said, you know, a man never goes to the same stream twice, you know, right? So it's... how has it changed since I started? Well, I've changed since I've started. And that's probably an evolution in Systema in my way, for me. So when I went to Systema, I was probably very psychologically broken from all the types of aggressive full contact systems that were geared towards hurting people. You know, what you do is what your brain becomes, and that's how you're going to start seeing the world. And so I'd become a lot happier, a lot more content, a lot more free with myself, a lot less judgmental, a lot less desire to damage people or hurt them, or which may be a surprise to some. But I mean, I can tell that I've become a lot more content as a person, and and that's really the goal of Systema. I mean, it's not. I mean, how many fights are you really going to get into? I mean, unless you're in a military environment where your requirement is to be, on the plane going somewhere, and even then, I mean, how many real engagements are you going to get into on a hand-to-hand basis or shooting situations compared to the amount of time that you're not doing that? But if you're a regular civilian like most of us, I mean, really, and you're not in a security environment all the time, I mean, when was the last time either one of you was in a knockdown, drag-out street fight? I mean, so if the evolution of the art is to create stable, happy, healthy human beings, I would say it's evolved very well towards that, yeah. If you're asking me if the evolution of the art has moved away from the more combative aspects into doing that, well, if it has, then I think that's a good idea, personally, in a lot of ways, because the combat aspect of it is already there. So you could, learn how to punch a wall for the next 10 years and probably be a decent at punching people in the face, right? But would it help you as a human being? Probably not, I mean, I think I know what you're asking. There's an argument out there, especially amongst people who've split off from the early training and gone off and done their own thing, saying, well, Vladimir doesn't teach as combatively as he used to and everything else, but I think he does. I mean, I just think that you're not even looking, if you're not seeing what it is that you're looking for, you're probably looking for the wrong things. You probably just don't even understand the art well enough to understand where that, I mean, if you're showing that you're dangerous, then you've failed in Systema, right? But if you're not at the same time becoming more dangerous, you've probably also failed in Systema in some way, right? So the idea of the art is to not show that you're dangerous, and yet be incredibly effective when necessary, right? So if you're sitting, in an armchair like this, watching Vladimir or myself or any number of people that you might be watching on YouTube and saying, well, it wasn't like that in my day. Back in the day, we used to fight like crazy, and the aggression was obvious and everything else. Well, that's absolutely opposite of what it is that you're trying to learn in Systema. Because if you're showing that you're aggressive and powerful and dangerous and everything else, then that's, I wouldn't say that that's probably ideal Systema, right? But if you look at someone like Vladimir and say, well, he doesn't look very dangerous at all, but the guy's incredibly dangerous, and far more dangerous than when I first met him. I mean, or should I say far more deadly, probably, than when I first met him. When I first met him, he was probably more dangerous because he was showing more, in a sense of being dangerous. But that doesn't mean that he's less deadly now. He's probably far more deadly because you can't see that he's dangerous. So I mean, I would say that's the evolution of the art. And in doing so, you're going to attract people who are not looking to hurt people all the time and prove their ego to themselves and everything else. And then, so the art is definitely evolving in a very positive way, I think. Yeah. I think you can learn the concept of Systema in a week or a couple of hours, really. But I think understanding what you've learned could probably then take you a lifetime, and you probably wouldn't get that much closer. I mean, it's incredibly difficult to understand what it is that you're learning, but learning it itself, I think, is relatively easy in that sense.
Okay.
Because you're only working with tools you already have. You don't have to learn a whole new tool set as far as like how you react to things or how your But what you have to do is recognize what's happening whilst you're doing those things, and that's quite difficult. You don't realize that Systema is a mind art that kind of expresses itself as a martial art pretty early on, and you're probably not really going to advance much further. For me, I mean, some other people might approach it from a very different point of view and see it in a very different way and be very successful. And I think that's what's nice about Systema is, it's like, you know, if you taught a martial art, if you taught someone paint the same way as you teach a martial art, they would only paint in a neoclassical way, or they would only be an architect in brutalism, or they would only be, but they're not. I mean, architects, every single type of architect that could be, or every type of artist that could be, and more different variations and versions are coming up all the time. I mean, that's the point of art, is to push those boundaries and to express a different type of truth from that lie, in a way, right? And I think that's where Systema is very versatile again, you know, that each person could be effective with the art in a certain way, whether it's in combat, or whether it's as a healing aspect, or whether it's both of those, or multiple, or psychological aspects and everything else. And they could all use the same fundamental underpinnings that you're teaching and express it in a different way that could be effective in a different environment. So it depends who's doing it. I didn't learn it that way from when I was, you know, regularly training with Vladimir all the time, and for good reason, I think. I mean, I'd already learned that way. You know, I'd worn gloves, I'd worn a groin protector, I'd worn mouth guards and things like that, and, you know, headgear and all that. And so for me, it wasn't as useful as learning, well, what is the precision of where is your knuckle meant to be on the face, or on the, you know, the spinal structure, or the internal, you know, how do I reach those internal states in somebody in a certain, you know, through striking or through touching them in some form or another.
But for a regular student that they learn,
I think it's all useful. I don't think you should ignore any aspect of training that's available to you until you've tried it. And then you can discard it or say, yeah, this is a lie. But I mean, I used to find this with my own training. Like, okay, so I had initially something like Kempo, which is this sort of like relatively versatile system. You know, you can use it for street fighting, one person or multiple people, or there's some weapon aspect in it, right? Okay. Right, so to learn that better, and I realized early on as well that the guy who developed that art had done boxing and judo before he'd done a version of Kempo that he then redeveloped into this. So I thought, well, maybe I should learn boxing and judo and to understand, again, the deeper structures of what it is that he's showing me. And each time I got into an art, I'd be like, oh, what was I thinking? This is the way to do a martial art, right? So now I'm a boxer, and so everything I do is, you know, I'm going to slip and move, I'm going to elbow or, you know, punch and rotate, and, you know, this is incredibly effective. I'm going to keep doing that, and I'm only going to think in these terms now, and I'm going to keep going down that road until there's no more road to be had. Well, then UFC came along and the grapplers came in, and you're like, oh, boxing doesn't work at all. You know, what was I thinking? And now I'm going to be a grappler. Oh, now I'm going to go down that road until, for the next couple of years, or 5 years, or 10 years, or whatever, until I exhaust that completely. Oh, okay. Oh, well, then the Dog Brothers came along. Oh, well, what if you have a knife or a stick from full contact fighting? Well, that grappling's not going to work in that way at all. Oh, well, now I've got to be a knife fighter. Oh, well, if I'm knife fighting, well, then boxing doesn't work in the same way, and grappling doesn't work in the same way, and blah, 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 you know. And so I would go down, chasing down these rabbit holes of roads, completely convinced in my head that that was the way to go, right? Until I saw the next thing, and then I chased down that road, and then the next thing. And I'm glad I did, because obviously you get a lot of experience in one aspect of something, but if you don't then see the limits of that aspect, you're going to miss out on the map, right? The map's what's important, not the roads. You know, the roads are just telling you where you are on the map. That's all. And they should interconnect and maneuver. You know, you should be able to shift them around in ways that they will allow you to work on the map effectively. And it's the same with Systema. If you're only going down the soft path and slow movement and allowing people to work in the way that they want to work, you can chase down that road for the rest of your life and be completely happy. And I'm not saying don't do that. If that is your interest, if you're interested in the Tai Chi-like aspect of the art and the health aspects of that and the sort of mental expansion from that you could get, or whatever it is that you feel is positive, chase down that road and go down that road for the rest of your life. I think it's a great road to go down. But if you then say to yourself, well, what happens when I amp up the speed and power? Or what happens, well, okay, well, that might be a dangerous thing to do. Well, maybe we should wear gloves to try that first of all. And once I'm comfortable in that environment, then maybe I take the gloves off. But maybe not. Maybe, maybe not having the gloves on will show you a road in that full contact sense that you realized you couldn't actually do in a real fight without breaking your hands. And so that'd be important not to do that. But, even like getting hit in the groin or something like that, I wore a cup in half the martial arts that I was doing because if you got hit in the nuts enough, you might break them, I don't know. But when I went to Vladimir and said, well, should I wear a cup? He says, well, why? He said, do you wear a cup all day? And I said, no. He said, well, when are you going to get attacked? When you're wearing a cup or when you're not wearing a cup? And I'm like, probably not when I'm wearing a cup. Well, then you better learn how to be sensitive to someone kicking you in the nuts and be able to move off of that and recognize the tension pattern, because the more protected you are, the more you're going to ignore things because you already have protection. You're going to kind of like half register them, you're going to half be in, but you can't half be in something. You got to, all of your, not focus, but all of your capable attention on that should be there. But if all of your focus is on it, then you're also in trouble. So you've got to kind of like figure out how to, be more sensitive, basically. And then the more you're going to definitely gain sensitivity by not wearing protection. Yeah. So again, you have to decide, look, am I training to get better, or am I training to survive in a real confrontation? Well, how often am I going to be in a real confrontation compared in my normal life as a non-professional, compared to how many times I would like to go training and get better at what it is I'm trying to understand. Again, it's a balance now. I don't really wear protection myself at this stage, but because my interests are different. But
only if the student asks you. And
but also, if you're training in your 50s the way you are in your 20s, you've completely missed some understanding, right? You're simply not capable of doing things the same way back then, physically and mentally. You didn't have the understanding that you have now. So you should be evolving with your training for your purpose. How was I training when I was probably, I guess, coming up through Systemas to where I am now, whatever stage? Again, I don't really consider that what I was doing then was right or wrong, or whatever I'm doing now is right or wrong. It's just, you just have to see where you are and what it is you're doing, and are you advancing mentally and physically and spiritually in some way. And I like to think I am, Now I think I can do things, and that's one of the beauties of doing Systema, is that, if you find a way of training at it effectively for yourself, you do get better. It doesn't matter. Look at Vladimir now. Compared to 20 years ago, yes, he could do certain things, or he was more likely to do certain things back then differently to how he might do them now, but I think he's far more effective now than he was when I first met him. From my experience with him, and I don't go and do like a. I'm not going to spend 2 hours in the gym doing like pulling weights around or doing rubber band training now in the same way as I might have done 10 years ago or 15 years ago or something.
You still go time to time to the gym or something like that?
Well, I'm in the gym all the time. I mean, I'm training 5-6 hours a day anyway.
Okay.
And I'm teaching or sparring or
So this is your daily routine? Is say every day a few hours? You still do?
Yeah, but I don't kick myself if I don't go in either. So if I you need certain things you start to realize. Well, you need recovery time. Otherwise you're not going to recover. You're not a machine. You're human, and recognizing yourself as a human is a really important aspect of your training to get better. Because if you treat yourself like a machine, then you're going to break like a machine. You're definitely going to get it good up to a point, but then you're going to start to go downhill. There's no two ways about it. You just need recovery time. My diet is different now. I tend to do as much intermittent fasting as I can do. If I can eat one meal a day, that would be perfect. And what that meal is also important. Realizing that I need some sort of contemplative, meditative time during the day or the week is also important. I love my dog Sophie, and one of the things I like to do is when I walk her is listen to a book or something like that, but then it's more important for me to spend more time with her, not listening to anything, right, and just allowing my mind to sort of like play in whatever space it's been, sort of like whatever soup it's been making, to show me what that tastes like for a while. And I get a lot of inspiration from not doing things, not having any more input, and letting the mind kind of like see what is, because I have a pretty complete schedule. I write. I'm writing a book at the moment and doing a lot of studying. I just came from a Harvard neuroscience conference with my writing partner Mike for a week, and I studied a lot of, we back and forth with a lot of neuroscience papers and books and things like that, and arguments with each other. I have the physical aspect of the training, where I'm in the gym sometimes from 9 a.m. until 8 p.m. at night. And that could be working out with a student or sparring with, more advanced students on a full contact, bare knuckle environment that we've set parameters for in certain ways. Could be multiple attackers, it could be this, if I'm teaching a class and there's even number of students in it, then I probably move between them, explaining things and moving with them. If there's an odd number, I'll just become one of the students in the class and spar with everyone and, move through that on it. And when you're racking up those kind of numbers and that kind of volume of interactions over a week, and then that's 2 weeks, and then that's 52 weeks in a year, and plus going to seminars and teaching 5 hours, 6 hours a day, and with a bunch of groups of new people that want to interact with you in a certain way. And I think anybody who trains with me knows that, I'm more interested in an honest expression of what we're doing than some kind of making ourselves feel good about it. If you've never heard me say don't miss, then you probably haven't trained with me. So don't try and miss me with the knife. Don't try and, and if I don't get stabbed, and if I don't get punched, and if I don't get taken down in some way by people I'm training with, then they're probably not trying.
They're scared.
Right? Yeah, and I don't want that. I need honest interaction to be able to learn how to have mistakes. And neuroplasticity doesn't happen when you're doing things right. It happens when you do things wrong, and you have to sort of change the network in some way and reconfigure how you're looking at things. And I don't want to be static. And there's a thing in screenwriting that says when you first meet your character, they should be in a state of stasis equals death. okay, so that they're going nowhere. And if they carry on going nowhere, they're going to die, either physically, mentally, or spiritually in some way. And the whole journey of what they do in the film is to move them out of that static position, mentally or physically or spiritually, right? You're a filmmaker, right?
That's very Robert McKee and
You're
Bill
right,
Snyder.
so it's Robert McKee. Yeah, it is, yeah. And
Save the cats.
yeah, so, yeah, and you got to kind of like, force them into confronting that, and that should be your training. I mean, if you're in a static environment that you're not, that you've already understood what it is that you're doing, and you're not pushing yourself to understand what you're not doing, then you're already in a death state. As far as I'm concerned, you've already. What's the point? But so I like to be. If you can kill me, I'm quite happy to try and figure out how not to, for that not to happen. And then I can teach it, because how can you teach? How can you learn if you're not making mistakes? And I think that's the other thing with Systema as well. I mean, the amazing thing about having teachers like, Mikhail Ryabko and Vladimir, Vasilyev is that they're so incredibly good that it's hard to see them make mistakes. I mean, they make mistakes all the time. I mean, they're humans, I mean, Michael just passed away, of course, but you work with them enough, you'll feel them make mistakes, and then you realize, well, it's not the mistakes they're making that's important, it's the recovery that's important. They're so good at recovering from mistakes that you can't really tell that they're shifting from one state into another. And you're like, well, okay, maybe that's interesting. That's a key right there. How do you shift with somebody from a mistake into an advantage without them noticing? And so that they think that it's all advantage. And then you're like, well, maybe it's not the mistakes or the advantages that's important, but how the other person's perceiving what you're doing that's important. And you kind of like go through these processes. But if you really think that they got as good as they are without making mistakes, then you are living on Kalau Cuckoo Land. I mean, it's impossible. Nobody's born doing Systema like that. I mean, it's just impossible. It just doesn't work that way. And for myself, if I'm not in that sort of, recognizing the difference between that expectation and result, and seeing how I'm making mistakes, and seeing how to, decelerate from my own reactions so that they can't see that I've made a mistake, or makes it more difficult, and seeing how to apply that and change their perception of reality in some way. How are you going to learn that without making mistakes? And how are you going to not make mistakes if the other guy doesn't actually try and get you? So as a teacher, if you're training in Systema and you want to teach Systema, and you think, well, I should emulate Vladimir or Mikhail in some way, or whoever it is that you admire, and you don't allow yourself to be vulnerable in front of your students, then you're then also passing that knowledge on to them, because you're not learning anything, and nor are they. If you're just like one of the things early on with Vladimir that was hardest on me was I was really good at mimicking people. If someone showed me a roundhouse kick, I could do that roundhouse kick within a couple of tries, very well. Maybe not quite as good as them, maybe, but sometimes, within, they could spend a lifetime doing it. I just had that ability to try and to really mimic things really well, and sort of like figure out what it is that they were doing. And I tried that with Vladimir when I first met him, and it was just chaotic, because it didn't matter if I mimicked him, and he wasn't working off, well, if I do this, they do this, or if they do this, I do this. It was like trying to copy someone. It's like him having a conversation with me, and me then mimicking that conversation with somebody else, but it didn't make any sense, because the other person's asking me for coffee, and I'm saying, talking about, going to the store for bread or something. It didn't make any sense. And so the first thing I started that really made my first leap was, copying him is not going to help. It might help me understand how to move better in certain ways, but it's not going to help me understand this art in any form. And in fact, the less I copy him, the better I'm going to get, more effectively, more accelerated, you know. And so then you're going to start looking, well, not what, again, going back to where we started, you know, it's not what he's doing, but the structure that is producing that spontaneous expression is going to be important to understand. So, but to understand that structure, you have to deal with reality. And if you're not dealing with reality, then you're just in that copying stage. And then you're going to make sure that the people around you are only giving you attacks that you can use that copying to make yourself comfortable in that space. But fighting's not a comfortable space. You have to make uncomfortable comfortable. So, I mean, I think one of the harder things for some people to realize with Systema is that there isn't a ranking system, and that rank is not important in that thing, because you do want goals. Everyone wants goals. I mean, you know, we've been brought up with goals. I mean, you go to school and, you know, you pass an exam, and if you pass that exam, you get to go to the next level, and you know, and then you write those things down and you show them to somebody else, and then somebody else understands they can employ you because you've passed these different layers of understanding, right? And you've embodied them in some way. And I definitely have been through systems that rank was very important. In fact, rank probably outdid knowledge in many ways. You know, I mean, you know, that people at a certain point were more interested in becoming higher ranks than they were getting better at their martial art, because that gave them a certain access in a certain way, and, you know, blah blah blah. But then, you know, there's no ranks in boxing, right? I mean, your boxing rank is whether you win a competition against the other guy or not. And, you know, and more competitions, and then maybe you'll become a world champion, or you know, an amateur champion or something like that. And so you understand that your rank is not your rank, but your status is what's important, you know, in some way. And then you have something like Systema, where you don't have any ranks at all. But to say we don't have rank in Systema is not entirely true either. You know, I mean, you know, Vladimir would be considered a master of Systema, and Michael, obviously, maybe even, I've heard people bandy around the world like Grandmaster now and stuff like that. And, you know, I'm in various group were at some certain point were termed as senior instructors, and I guess you're working towards being a master in some way. And then you have, what is it? What's the other term? What's the group? What's it? A system instructor? No.
Yes, instructor in training.
Instructor in training, right? So to say there's no rank in Systema is, I think, a bit of a, you know, misnomer. But I like the concept of it better, which is, I mean, the basic idea behind the concept, I think, is important, which is, A, who's to really judge what level you're at, right? If you're not, I mean, again, if your purpose in Systema is to be good at combat, well, the ideal of Systema is, in that sense, is to be able to go behind enemy lines and take out a target and come back. So, I mean, if you're not doing that, then you're not a black belt in Systema, right? Yeah, maybe the next day might be a class on multiple attackers. Well, how do you judge if you've won that unless everybody's on the ground? And they've got to be coming at you full contact and trying to kill you at the same time. Well, who does that all the time? Or just in the combat thing, you know, and then you got knife fighting, stick fighting, gun fighting, you got, you know, improvised weapons, you got right, fighting inside car. So it's no longer rank, it's more like Boy Scout badges. Okay, I'm good at this one, I'm good at this one, I'm good at this one, I'm good, well, you know, you need a big arm full of Boy Scout badges then. Well, what's the point of the Boy Scout badges? Well, yes, they do show proficiency in some way, but they also make the Boy Scout kind of feel good about themselves, right? It's a confidence thing. Well, what is confidence? Well, confidence is useful, but if it leads to ego, then that's starting to destroy your knowledge, right? So, and I think this is one of the hardest things that people don't know. You know, it's the hardest thing to understand about something like Systema, is that, well, if your knowledge is based on your rank, and your rank is tied to your ego, well, it would be impossible to have that rank, because the concept of Systema is to destroy your ego, or dissolve your ego, so that you can understand Systema. Because if your ego is getting in the way, there's no way you can connect your conscious mind and your unconscious mind, because your ego is between those two things, and it's separating them. And when you dissolve them, then you're going to start making connections between your unconscious and your conscious mind that you would not be able to make before. And that's when Systema becomes really interesting, because that's when you have that spontaneity and that sensitivity and that timing and stuff, because you're no longer having to translate that through your ego network, right? And in fact, your ego network itself is dissolving and dissipating into new connections and stuff like that. And so, you know, really the goal of Systema as an art mentally is neuroplasticity. But the higher your ego is, the less that neuroplasticity is probably going to happen, because you're blocking it. And so the conundrum is, well, how do you know how good you are in Systema without having rank? Well, that depends where your ego is. You know, so it's kind of like, so the point of not having rank is to not develop ego.
Okay,
right?
So what you're talking about is also very different from not having an objective, precise objective, right?
Well, goals are different to rank.
Okay, exactly.
I mean, you can have, but then again, having internal goals, I think, is much more important than other people telling you what your goals should be at certain stages, because again, it's going to kind of form ego if you achieve them, right? But if you have internal goals that say, well, this is my objective, I can tell, I could videotape myself, I could, or I could have others observe me, but I can just tell, I know if I'm taking the knife off somebody and putting them on the ground. I know if in the multiple attack they're crushing me, or if I'm starting to gain advantage or in some way, you know. So on a combat level, that's one thing. I would say that, you know, having rank is going to start to form ego, and forming ego is going to start pulling away from your understanding of Systema, and so it's going to be counterproductive to learning. On another level is, what if you're not interested in being a top combat specialist in Systema, and you're interested in healing people and using the system in a combative way if you like, but more towards like helping your community or whatever? Well, what rank is there for that? Are you a black belt in healing? Right? Does your black belt translate from healing to healing someone to death if you want to use it in a combative sense? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense, because the concept doesn't really lend itself towards a ranking system, because the concept is so diverse as to what you can apply it to, you know. And so,
and if we see the history of martial arts, ranking belts, let's say not ranking, but belts didn't make sense as well.
No, not really. I mean, they're more. I mean, in modern martial arts, they're probably more tied to commercial factors anyway. In that sense, I'm not against belts. I think if you're like jiu-jitsu, for example, I mean, you have to fight for your belt, right? You've got to show a certain proficiency against purple belts and blue belts to get a purple belt. It's not necessarily how many techniques. I mean, it's important to understand a certain amount of techniques to do that, because that's going to give you the knowledge to be able to do that. And then as you gain proficiency, you're going to eventually possibly become a black belt, which is a very difficult thing to do in a decent jiu-jitsu club. Right? If you're a black belt in jiu-jitsu, you're probably a pretty handy dude that knows how to grapple very effectively against anybody, right? Well, I've seen people in karate who, or certain other arts that didn't have to do that, and no matter what belt they have, they probably have the ability of a poor fighter. I don't know if that matters. It doesn't to me. I don't care about those sorts of things anymore. Even when I was in the systems that did have belts, I wasn't particularly driven by the belt structure very much. I was more into the proficiency of whatever it is that I personally was doing. But that's me, and that's why I didn't get very high in the belt ranking system, because I didn't like to play those political, whatever it is, to get through those things, because I didn't really care about it. But again, I mean, if we're just talking about Systema, I would say, having personal goals is important. Being honest with yourself as to where you are on that structure. If you're not reaching your goals, then figure out how to do that. But not having an ego not developing an ego because we don't have belts is also important. Like, well, those guys have belts and we don't, so we're better. That's again defeating the object. I mean, the idea is to dissolve the ego, not to just push it over to another direction. And I think that also was what happens generally to some of the, certain instructors have moved away from Systema for their own reasons. And I have no problem. If you want to stay in the art, stay in the art. If you don't want to be in the art, then don't be in the arts. I don't think of it as a good thing or a bad thing. Maybe they've gone off and done something more important in another way for the people that they're training in another way. But I think definitely in a couple of cases, I've seen, I have an ego. You can't help having an ego. You're never going to be a decent fighter unless you have some kind of an ego. You've got to want to be good at some point and be able to beat somebody else in some way, and that's ego. And there's no two ways about it. But if you can't recognize that ego, if you can't dissolve it in some way or put it to some good use, then you will eject yourself from Systema anyway. Because if you can't recognize your own ego, the system will not allow you to progress in it, because it's designed to be counter to that. And so you'll just kind of like pop off like a cork and go off and do something else, But again, I don't think that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think whatever your path is what's important to you, and if you help other people through that path, there's certain people in Systema that might not have an ego that are not helping anyone at all, so that might not be. Well, it's more tied to, I think the people who are really good at Systema that I recognize as the teachers of the art, that I can see, like Vladimir and Michael and people like that, they're also very fundamentally religious people, and so and the type of religion that I can, as far as I can tell, that they follow or disciples of or disciplined in, is something that really looks at how to dissolve your ego. And so by recognizing that in themselves, I think they also recognize that that's helped them understand the concept of Systema a lot better. And so when they talk about dissolving ego, it's not just because they've done Systema, it's because they've done parallel
in our case,
disciplines.
We were not.
Yeah,
we're
not as pious as that. Again, you find how to dissolve ego in your own way, right? I found it by running into Vladimir and just having my ass handed to me every time I do. So there's no value in me thinking to myself, well, I'm good at this, or I'm good at martial arts or whatever, because every time I run into this guy, I'm terrible at it, and or Michael, or people like that, and or I can be with an absolute beginner who stabs me in the gut, and I'm like, you got to rethink this, Martin. Whatever you were doing was not working the same way as you think you're going to work. So you're constantly in this sort of ego battering environment that tells you you're not as good as you think you are, and that's one way of doing it. Another way for me is studying physics and studying mind sciences and studying things that nobody understands. And the more I do that, the more I realize that my viewpoint of the universe is probably not as accurate as what I think it is. And so, that's going to start battering your ego down quite a lot.
That's why is the philosopher point of view, right? The more you know, the less you know.
Yeah, right. Or you might just like have a relationship with your significant other and you know, lose your temper and realize that you didn't have control of your ego the way you thought you did and stuff like that. So if you're aware of what's happening to you, if you can take some sort of like back seat and see actually how you're interacting with your universe in some way, then I think that you're at least attempting to recognize your ego in some way. And through doing that, you'll get better at Systema. If you attach rank to that, I think you're going to start pulling yourself away from that, you know. Or if you attach meaning to that rank in some way, you know. So I would say whatever reason you think you're starting, it's not going to be the reason you'll end up doing it. So enjoy both those processes. I think you should train as much as your schedule allows, and I think you should listen to your body, and if you're exhausted and don't feel that you want to go train, then maybe that's a good time to stop that day and maybe come back the next day when you feel like you want to be there. I think you should also push yourselves at times and when you don't want to be there. And I would say if you were to ask 90% of your students why they came, they would probably say, because I want to learn how to defend myself and my family in some form. They have some fear of being punched and kicked and stabbed, which they don't really have a reference as to how to deal with, right? If you were asked them the same question a year later, they might have a very different answer. So setting goals, I think, is always important. I think your mindset is incredibly important as to when you are training, as to what that means to you, because that's going to change your physiology, your mentality, everything. But I think really what Systema teaches you is how to listen to yourself, and if you're not listening to yourself, you're probably not learning what it is you need to learn. And listening to yourself is going to tell you, look, I don't think I'm advancing fast enough by coming once a week, if advancement is what's important to me. But some people might be Sunday clubbing and saying, I really enjoy going once a week and I gain a lot out of that, and I get to spend 6 days a week with my family then. You know, again, why are you training? What is it you're trying to get out of the training? And if you're training to defend your family, well, and yourself and your family, that's important. But if your training is to have a better relationship with your family, which is another form of defending them, then maybe going twice a week is enough. But if you're a single guy or girl or whatever, and you're completely obsessed with training for a while, then maybe going 5 times a week isn't enough. I don't know. It wasn't for me. I mean, I couldn't train enough. But I mean, I also have to and I also had to recognize that not everybody. It took me a while to realize that not everybody wanted to train the way I wanted to train, and so I lost a bunch of training partners by pushing them too hard, because I thought, well, if you're not coming up to my standard, then you're not going to make it. But then I didn't really understand what their criteria of making it was. So I think learning how to listen to yourself, I think probably on average though, if you're training 3 times a week, that's probably a good minimum. Just saying all that. Maybe a seminar every now and again or something. You know, you need a good intensive amount of time, you know, where you're on the mat, probably 4 or 5 hours as well, to push through certain barriers. I mean, it is, if you're coming to a martial art for fighting, learning how to fight is important, and time and energy and all these things need to be learned, understood how to manage better, and you know, pushing yourself through workouts can sometimes help you do that.